May we join our hearts in prayer. O Lord, may the words of my mouth, the thoughts of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Last week, when I was over at the jail to visit one of our members, I was standing in line to get a visitor's pass, and the woman ahead of me began a conversation. And at one point she asked, "Are you prayed up?" And I looked at her strangely, and she said, "Not paid up, but prayed up. Are you prayed up?" And then she went on to say that she just couldn't cope with everything that happened if she hadn't given everything to God in prayer, if she hadn't prayed up. She couldn't turn everything over to God and trust that God would see her through. Later, I heard her talking to someone. It takes a while once you get up to the visitor's place for visitors to be allowed to see you, and she was telling this old friend what had happened. Her youngest son had gone in jail, and so she had had to sell her house and use up all of her life savings to pay for his legal fees. Now he had been out on probation for 3 years, but had gotten into a car with some friends that he shouldn't have, and they had been stopped for driving under the influence. And since there was a weapon in the car, he was back in jail. She didn't know where she was going to find the funds to pay for more lawyers, or how she was going to get him to turn his life around. But she said again, "But I'm prayed up. I know God's going to get me through." As I walked back across the windy plaza from the Justice Center back to the church, I thought about her story. In many ways, she reminded me of Job. She'd had many of her possessions taken away. Her family was in disarray, and yet she still held on to her faith in God. She trusted that God would see her through and somehow be with this son of hers, and in the end, God would prevail. She had some hope for the future. Now, the story of Job comes from a time when the Israelites were at a low point in their national life. They had been overrun by the Babylonian Empire, and the Babylonians decided that they would take most of the leadership of Israel into captivity far away to Babylon, which is in the area of Iran and Iraq, far away from the Middle East. And so not only were they removed from their homeland, but they had been forced to abandon many of their customs and much of their worship life. And their old beliefs were turned upside down as well, for they had understood that wealth was a sign of God's favor, and that punishment, hard times, were a sign that God was displeased with you. But now they had to think about something else. Why do the righteous suffer? Is there any point in keeping faith with God? Or, as our modern author would say, why do bad things happen to good people? And that's a question that many people today are asking as our own lives have been turned upside down with foreclosure crises and banking crises and job crises. We could add to the list. And certainly all of those have put strains on relationships. There is much suffering around us. Some we can understand, we can see the causes of the suffering, but there is much suffering that we don't understand. And that is part of the question that the book of Job poses for us. And it is to the end of the book of Job that we eventually need to turn to see if there is some help for us. At the very beginning of the book of Job, he has it all. He's got great wealth, unimaginable wealth. He's got family. He's got children who are well married. He's got a house. And by the end of the first chapter, he has lost everything except his life, and his health and his wife. And in the second chapter, Satan, the tempter, tells God, if you mess with somebody's health, they'll deny you. They will abandon their faith. And so Job is afflicted with boils. He has his faith, and even his wife comes to him with one solution. Curse God and die. Give up your faith. It isn't worth it. God hasn't been faithful to you. God isn't upholding that end of the covenant relationship. So just forget about God. Job responds to her that is not the choice he's going to make. He asserts, at least in chapter 2, that one cannot simply believe in God, that God will only provide good, that suffering is from God and is a part of life. In chapter 3, which we didn't read, Job's 3 loyal friends come to sit with him. Now, my Old Testament professor, Bob Bowling, said that the very best thing that Job's friends did was to sit in silence, not to say anything, to sit with another and to allow them to speak, not to try and solve things, may be enough. Some of you know my husband Paul is an engineer, and he tells me that engineers are to provide solutions. That's what they're trained to do. So after about 15 years, when we finally both read Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, he got the shock of his life. Women simply want to be heard. They gather with their girlfriends and they talk, and nobody has to solve any problems. Sometimes just listening is all that is called for. And so he had to turn his engineering world a little bit on the side from time to time. Job's friends couldn't do that. Job's friends could only sit in silence for 7 days, and then they had to speak. They start by pushing Job to examine his life. What did you do wrong? Surely there is something that you have done that has angered God. This goes on for 3 rounds of conversation, and each time Job's friends become harsher and harsher. It's got to be your fault, they seem to say. God only punishes those people who've done something wrong. Bad things only happen to bad people. They imply that God has abandoned Job. And finally, by chapter 23, Job has had enough of this. These are not friends for this time in his life. Job wants to argue his case before God. He believes that if he can put his case before God, he will get justice. But he knows, as Old Testament believers knew, that to face God, to see God face to face, was to die. And at least in chapter 23, Job doesn't quite know where God is. He's searching, but he can't find him. But like the woman at the jail I told you about, Job believes that God will eventually act justly, for God is in charge of the world. And finally, toward the end of the book, in chapter 38, Job gets his wish. God does come out of the whirlwind to answer him. He speaks to Job, Job speaks with him, and Job does not die. He gets to be in dialogue with the Creator. But God begins by asking Job a series of questions. And at first they appear to be rhetorical, with no way for Job to answer. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Have you commanded the morning? Who provides the raven's young with prey?